Dr. Julian Vance had treated injuries from across the stars, but he had never seen a case like this. Queen Avarice of the Xyrian Empire lay before him, her silver skin losing its glow, her breathing weak. The medical monitors hummed softly, but the numbers were grim. She was dying. Her people had brought her to Earth in desperation, their own medical science failing. They claimed her condition was rare, something no Xyrian had ever survived. Yet they had placed their last hope in human hands. If she died, the balance of power between their worlds could crumble. The Xyrians weren't just a proud species, they were warriors. Without their queen, war was inevitable. Julian adjusted the settings on the medical scanner, his brow furrowed. He had spent the last 12 hours studying her deteriorating condition, searching for anything that could stop it. Organ failure. Cellular breakdown. Her blood, a shimmering violet liquid, was destabilizing by the minute. Doctor, a voice rumbled behind him. General Vero, the Queen's guardian, stood like a statue, his deep red cloak pooling around his broad frame. His piercing gaze didn't waver. She must live. Julian exhaled sharply. I'm doing everything I can. It is not enough. He turned, meeting the alien's gaze. Then maybe you should have brought her to a god instead of a doctor. Vero's expression darkened, but before he could speak, Julian's assistant, Dr. Melka, interrupted. The reptilian woman's emerald eyes flickered with concern as she gestured to the monitor. Her vitals are dropping faster. If we don't act now... Julian's stomach clenched. He had never lost a patient he could save, and he wasn't about to start now. What treatments have been attempted? We tried cellular regeneration, Melka said. Her body rejected it. Xyrian medicine has failed. Julian's mind raced. The problem wasn't just her body shutting down, it was that nothing recognized her biology well enough to stabilize it. Every attempt to heal her was being rejected like an invader. A soft, ragged breath escaped from the bed. Human. Julian turned sharply. Avarice's golden eyes were barely open, her gaze hazy but locked on him. It was the first time she had spoken since arriving. Her voice was soft, yet it carried something powerful beneath the weakness. You fight for me? Julian hesitated for only a moment before answering. I don't lose patience. A faint smile touched her lips, barely there. Even lost causes? Especially lost causes. A brief silence passed between them, and then her eyes fluttered closed again. Julian straightened and turned back to the monitors. The numbers were still dropping. Melka shifted uneasily. We're running out of time. Julian tapped his fingers against the table, thinking. The only way to stop the rejection was to introduce something her body wouldn't fight against. Something foreign enough to bypass her failing systems, but compatible enough to sustain her. His breath caught as an idea formed. It was risky. It had never been done before. But if he was right, he turned to Melka. What if we use human DNA? Her eyes widened. That's impossible. Xyrian biology is. I know, Julian said. But think about it. Their own medicine isn't working. Maybe something from outside their genetic structure could stabilize her, at least long enough to keep her alive. Vero stepped forward, his massive form tense. You want to mix human blood with hers? Julian met his glare without flinching. I want to save her. This is the only way. The general's expression was unreadable. The Xyrians were deeply proud of their heritage. Mixing their queen's blood with another species was something no one had likely ever dared to suggest. For a moment, Julian thought Vero would refuse. But then, a weak whisper came from the bed. Do it. Vero's fists clenched. Your Majesty. I command it, Avarice said, voice barely audible. Let the human try. Silence filled the room. Then Vero turned sharply. Do as she says. Julian nodded, rolling up his sleeve. Get me the equipment. We're running out of time. The lab was eerily quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the steady beep of monitors. Julian stood over the sterile workstation, his hands moving swiftly as he prepared the genetic infusion. A vial of his own modified blood, mixed with a stabilizing agent, shimmered under the cold light. This was a reckless gamble, but logic told him it was the only way. Melka double-checked the infusion settings, her reptilian fingers moving deftly over the controls. "The compatibility levels are still unknown," she muttered. "There's a chance her body could reject this even faster than the other treatments." Julian tightened his grip on the syringe. "And there's a chance it'll save her." General Vero stood like a statue at the edge of the room, watching every move. His piercing gaze didn't waver as Julian turned to Queen Avarice. She lay still, her silver skin eerily pale, her golden eyes barely open. Despite her weakened state, there was no fear in her expression. Only quiet acceptance. "You are willing to do this, human?" she murmured. Julian exhaled. "I don't see another option." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "Neither do I." Carefully, Julian pressed the needle to her arm, inserting the serum into her failing veins. The moment the infusion began, the monitors spiked violently. Her body jerked. Her breath caught in her throat. The silver of her skin shimmered erratically, pulses of violet light racing through her veins. Melka cursed under her breath. "Her vitals are unstable." Julian grabbed Avarice's wrist, feeling for a pulse. "Come on, hold on," he whispered. The tension in the room was suffocating. Avarice's body tensed, her muscles locking as if caught in some unseen battle. Then, just as suddenly, she exhaled sharply, the tightness in her limbs releasing. The erratic readings on the monitors stabilized. Julian stared, hardly believing what he was seeing. Melka's voice was hushed with disbelief. "Her deterioration," it stopped. Avarice blinked up at him, her golden irises now sharp and focused. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked alive. She inhaled deeply, flexing her fingers. "I feel strange." Julian leaned forward. "Strange how?" She turned her hand over, studying the veins beneath her glowing skin. "Strange alive." A slow wave of relief crashed over Julian, but it was tempered by the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just medicine. This was rewriting the rules of biology. Melka frowned. "Doctor, we need to monitor her closely. If this infusion altered anything beyond stabilizing her." "We'll deal with it," Julian said. "Right now, she's alive." Avarice studied him, something unreadable flickering in her golden eyes. "You risked much for me, Julian Vance." Hearing his name on her lips sent a strange shiver down his spine. He forced himself to focus. "That's what doctors do." A small, knowing smile played at the edges of her mouth. "I think it is more than that." Vero stepped forward, his voice gruff. "Your Majesty, you should rest." Avarice turned to her guardian. "And yet, I have not felt this strong in days." She sat up slowly, her movements graceful but deliberate. Vero's expression was unreadable, but Julian could sense his unease. The warrior had wanted his queen to survive, but perhaps not like this. Julian met his gaze. "She's stable. That's what matters." Vero exhaled sharply. "For now." Melka interrupted, scanning the data. "Her vitals are stronger than expected. Her cells are no longer breaking down. In fact, they're regenerating." Julian's eyes widened. "Regenerating?" Melka nodded. "At an accelerated rate." Avarice flexed her fingers again, then slowly moved to touch Julian's wrist. "You have changed something within me." His pulse quickened under her touch. "I only gave you a chance to survive." Her lips curved. "And yet, I feel as though I am more." A silence stretched between them, thick with something neither of them fully understood. Julian cleared his throat and turned back to the monitors. "We'll continue running tests. If anything feels different, you will be the first to know," Avarice said softly. He nodded, but even as he focused on the medical data, he couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had just begun. Avarice stood in front of the medical station, her golden eyes reflecting the dim light of the room. Only hours ago, she had been on the brink of death, her body surrendering to an illness no Xerian had ever survived. Now, she felt stronger than she had in years. Julian watched her carefully, his mind racing with questions. He had expected the infusion to stabilize her at best, not transform her. Her posture was different, more upright, more confident. Even her silver skin had taken on a deeper glow, the violet veins beneath shimmering faintly with each movement. "How do you feel?" Julian asked, breaking the silence. Avarice tilted her head, considering the question. "I feel reborn." Melka checked the monitors, her reptilian features unreadable. Her cellular structure has changed. It's not just regeneration, her body is adapting. Vero crossed his arms, his expression grim. Adapting how? Melka hesitated before answering. Her body has accepted the human DNA, but it hasn't simply integrated it. It's enhancing her. Strength, endurance, even her neural pathways show increased activity. Julian ran a hand through his hair. That's impossible. It should have just stabilized her. Avarice turned to him, stepping closer. And yet, I am standing before you, stronger than before. The space between them felt charged, and for the first time, Julian noticed how her gaze lingered on him, not just with curiosity, but something deeper. "I owe you my life," she murmured. Julian swallowed. "I did what any doctor would." "No," she corrected, reaching out. Her fingers lightly brushed his wrist, sending an unexpected warmth through his skin. "You gambled with the impossible for me." He should have stepped back, but he didn't. Instead, he found himself studying her features, the way the golden glow of her eyes seemed to drink him in. Vero cleared his throat, his voice sharp. "This changes everything." Avarice didn't look away from Julian. "Yes, it does." Melka cut in, her voice urgent. "Doctor, there's something else." She turned the monitor toward him. Her biological structure is still shifting. It's as if her body is adapting itself further to match yours. Julian stiffened. "What?" Avarice finally turned from him, glancing at the readings. A curious expression crossed her face. "Fascinating." Vero, however, was furious. "You mean to tell me our queen is becoming human?" "Not exactly," Melka corrected. "But there is an undeniable influence. It's as if her body recognizes Julian's DNA as a foundation for something new." Julian let out a slow breath, realization settling in. If this continues, she won't just be a Xerian anymore. She'll be something else. Avarice touched her own wrist, feeling the pulse beneath her skin. "And if that is the case, I do not fear it." Vero's fists clenched. "You should." Julian stepped in. "We don't even know the full extent of what's happening. Jumping to conclusions won't help." Avarice smiled, her expression unreadable. "Do not mistake my acceptance for recklessness, General. I have ruled long enough to know when change is inevitable." Vero's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Julian turned back to Avarice. "For now, we need to monitor you closely. No unnecessary risks." She stepped closer again, her voice soft but firm. "And what if I find the greatest risk is resisting what has already begun?" Julian's pulse quickened. He had saved her life, but in doing so, had he altered something far greater than biology? The night air was cool as Julian stood outside the medical facility, staring up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Xerian Empire stretched across countless worlds, but here on Earth, their queen had become something new, something neither fully Xerian nor fully human. And it was his fault. Footsteps echoed behind him. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. "You left so suddenly," Avarice murmured, stopping beside him. Julian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I needed to think." "You regret saving me?" He turned to face her. The glow of the facility lights cast a soft sheen over her silver skin, her golden eyes holding a quiet intensity. She no longer looked like a dying queen in need of rescue. She looked radiant, strong, alive in a way that unsettled him. I don't regret saving you, Julian said carefully. But I don't know what I did to you. Avarice tilted her head. You gave me life. That is enough. It's more than that, he said. You're changing. Your body, your mind. I can see it. Her gaze didn't waver. And that frightens you? Julian swallowed. It should. She reached out, tracing her fingers along his wrist again, a touch that sent a strange warmth through his skin. But it does not. He couldn't answer. Couldn't bring himself to admit that the way she looked at him, the way she touched him, sent his heart racing in a way no logical explanation could dismiss. Avarice took a step closer, her voice softer now. I am not the same woman who lay dying in that bed. And I do not believe you are the same man who stood over me, uncertain if I would survive. Julian wanted to argue, but she was right. He had risked everything to save her, and now the distance between them felt thinner than it should have. I was raised to believe my destiny was set the moment I was born, she continued. That my duty was to my people, my empire. But now, I feel something else pulling me. Her fingers traced up his forearm, her golden eyes searching his face. Tell me, Julian, is this connection between us merely chance? Or is it something greater? His breath hitched. The answer should have been simple, just a biological response, the result of the infusion linking them in ways neither of them understood. But it didn't feel like science. It felt like fate. Avarice, he hesitated. This is dangerous. She smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't the serene expression of a queen, it was something more personal, more intimate. Life is dangerous, Julian. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But I would rather embrace the unknown with you than return to a life of certainty without you. His heart pounded. He knew the weight of what she was saying. If they crossed this line, there would be no turning back. Not for her, not for him. But when she leaned in, her lips just a breath away, he realized something. He didn't want to turn back. With a quiet exhale, he closed the distance between them. A gamble had changed everything once before. And now it was changing everything again.